So we're actually going to talk about AI adoption and some practical solutions and some things that you can do as you're thinking about your journey to AI, whether it's a specific project or it's for your larger organization. So I want to start off with, how many of you guys have built something and no one used it or didn't use it as much as you thought they were going to? Okay, there's a few. So I'm aging myself, but for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a picture from a movie called The Field of Dreams. The whole premise of the movie was, if you build it, they will come. So quite honestly, in technology, that is a kind of a premise that we've adopted pretty well, is we think that everyone's going to understand and know our amazingness and why we should use it, and they'll just see it, and they'll recognize it and understand it. Unfortunately, that's not the full way that it goes. There's some other things and other details and things that you're going to have to look into to how to help them really understand why it is the work that you've done is so great and is going to help them. All right, so a little bit of data for you. Some of these are from the last couple of years. And so to kind of put a fine point on it of why this stuff matters and really kind of talking about both the technical aspects as well as the human aspects is 85% of big data projects fail to move past the pilot stage. And that was actually up from the previous year. And so I've done a little digging, and so what was 2018? Actually, it increases even more. So thinking about that, you know, all of these projects are out there, all of these pilots, great things are starting, all of these things are happening. So why? Why aren't they being adopted? Why aren't people using it? Especially in big organizations. So you see your phone, you know, you can understand that there's AI on the phone, there's things that's happening. But, so again, why isn't that translating into the bigger organization? Unfortunately, it's the human elements. So the fundamental response to change is not logical, but it's emotional. Again, so I know everyone here and primarily is all into technology, but unfortunately, we are all humans as well. So we have to be thinking about all of the different aspects of it, and us as humans lead with our emotions. All right, I know a talk at DevFest associated with feelings, emotions, all of those things that are quite frankly scary or, oh, even worse, boring to talk about. So here, I want to put up this slide. So the latest trends in AI. From here, when you see this, you have deepfakes, adversarial, you have automated machine learning, you have predictive maintenance, you have all of these things. So I'm looking around the room, I'm looking at your faces. Some have great smiles. Some don't. Some look a little apprehensive. So imagine for the non-technical people as well, having to understand what any and all of these things mean. You know, and as fast as things and you learn one thing, the next thing comes. And the definitions of them are different. You're like, just take the definition of AI. You read it in one place, it means this. In another place, it means this. And right when you thought you got the definition, somebody offers you up another one. So just to remember, as fast as it's moving, it's an evolution and it's a journey and it's gonna keep happening. So again, these human elements of emotion and things like that are gonna keep going. All right, so this is within the last month or so to kind of put it in context of, is this really still a thing? Does everybody think Skynet's coming, the Terminator, what it is? So I'll point to these. I'd like to go to the news, and I like to go into it and search and just put up, you know, fear or AI or any of these types of things and see kind of what the sentiment is. What does it look like? What's happening? So fears of Terminator, robot uprising, sparked after scientists create creepy, lifelike machines that can eat, grow, and evolve. And then again, the Terminator-like picture. Or my favorite, the one I'm not going to be able to pronounce, but the top 5 fears in an anxiety disorder about driverless cars. There's an anxiety disorder about driverless cars now. So if that doesn't tell you anything, it should. It should. We are emotions-based, so we have to be able to account for it. We have to look at it. We don't all have to become psychologists, but we certainly may want to have some understanding of what the nuances are and what things are out there. Again, I'll just leave you with the last one. AI arms race risks rise of uncontrollable killer robots. This is there. It's real, and different people have different understandings of what these things mean. All right. So as I mentioned already, really want to think about the journey to AI as a journey. So how do you get there? It's a transformation, all of these aspects. And sometimes you may be the guy in the front. Sometimes you might be the guy in the back. Sometimes you might be the lady in the middle. Or you might not be on the mountain. So there's a lot of different places. And even within the larger organization, you may be so far ahead, but people in your own organization may not be there yet. All right, so we've talked a little bit and we said all about the emotions, the words, the different things. So this is out of change management. We do a lot of things associated with how do you get there? Most people think it's a little bit more binary, that I'm either gonna like it or I don't like it. It's not that, and there's a lot of different stages. So if you start to look with it, most starts with resistance and fear, what you don't know, what you don't understand. But to get to ownership, and ownership in this context really means I actually think AI is valuable for me in my professional life. I think it's going to be great for my job and help me. You don't actually need every single person to get to full ownership. Sometimes just acceptance will work. So a couple other things that I would say in terms of this chart to kind of keep in mind and think about is the more you kind of understand what people's potential reactions could be, the more you're actually going to be able to prepare them. So for example, you can tell them and say things like, hey, there's probably going to be a temporary productivity loss. In that case, you've already prepared them, that they know it, and it's not a surprise. There's things that you guys are taking advantage of and understanding because of your background, because of your training, and you have all that fundamental knowledge that somebody else may not have. So you want to kind of share that with them and how they start to get there, and it helps to start build buy-in and trust. All right, so fear. And this is an example and a question we get asked all the time. Why are people so afraid? Why are they afraid of AI? Why do they use it on their phone? But then when they go into their professional lives, no, this is going to replace my job. This is going to replace me. So that's exactly it. They start tapping into their base fears, those psychological needs. So look at the bottom: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, all of those aspects. So think about it. If I'm doing a job today and I now have a fear that, oh, wait, they may not need me, I'm instantly going, oh, wait, I have a house, I have kids. How am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to do those things? Eventually, rational thought will probably prevail, and you can show evidence and things like that. But that's your initial thing that you're having to start to get over to, where we may be in the tech field already at self-actualization, the desire to be the best that we can. So again, a different way to look at it in terms of what are people's base needs, what are the things, and why is there fear there? All right, so all hope is not lost. I put this in there because of my son. He's 10, and he bet me that I couldn't get Star Wars things into a work presentation. So of all the places, I figured this is the one to do it. All right, so we took a little bit of a look at some of the negative ones from that. Here, I've added in, so I want to make sure that we understand that it's actually moving in the right direction. Things are starting to go well. This is news from the last month as well. One of my favorites, AI took a test to detect lung cancer. It got an A. AI will be a vital tool in making the global economy more sustainable and efficient. So all of these things are starting to come in, and they're starting to change. So I've looked at these for the last couple of years in terms of where it is. Much more of them are going towards this now. So again, it starts showing you that cycle that we showed before, is that people are starting to understand it. They are starting to move farther to it. The answer is always, I get asked too, is so when, what date exactly? That's going to be different for most of the different parts of the population. So one thing I would encourage you to kind of do is don't look at the hole in the donut, look at the whole donut. So what does that mean? That means just don't get enamored with the tech. Make sure you're looking at all the different elements of what could be to get to and help your project, your company, your organization, your client get to being a data-driven organization. So associated with AI, that's really kind of the goal of what you're trying to do. So Booz Allen, one of the ways we look at it is associated with a framework. So start with analytic opportunities, data, analytic techniques, people, technology, and most importantly, culture. We call this ADAPT-C, and it is plus C. I want to make sure, not minus C. And the reason for it is you're not getting rid of culture. You're making sure that it's at the forefront. So things like analytic opportunities. We get asked a lot. Where do we start? What's the right project? How do we know how to evaluate it? Most of the time, the answer comes back to, let's look at some low-hanging fruit, stuff that can have a lot of impact, all of those things. How do you actually evaluate impact? How do you think about it? So these are the areas of how we think about it. Is the data in the right place? Is it accessible? Do we have it? What types of techniques do we want to apply to it? Do we have the ability to apply those techniques? What about our people? Is this, again, back to the human element, the emotional side of it, are our people ready? Are they skilled? How do they feel about this? Is this one of the ones that they're going to have major issues with? Then we have the technology side. So your infrastructure readiness, do you have the right infrastructure to have it in place in what you would need? And then again, the cultural side. So the cultural one is really hard to plan for, and you see a lot of the times, one of my least favorite things is when I see a culture plan. To be honest, it says we are going to do this, and this is our strategy for culture. Culture should be embedded into everything that you're doing, and it should be part of the overall. So if you're doing AI strategies, it should be an element that is weaved throughout and not a separate, because quite frankly, it's everybody's responsibility, and leaders drive the culture, but everybody else lives the culture, makes the culture, and can kill the culture too. All right, so it really takes a village. So when I say that, there's a lot of different aspects of how to look at this in terms of what are people's roles, what do they have, what do they do. So think about it as this. Analogy is like building a house. There's a lot of different types of functional specialists, things that you would do. So you have your electricians, you have your plumbers, you have your foundation people, the roofers, all of those. When you're trying to get to an AI-driven organization, you have all of those roles as well. So it's really important that everybody has an understanding of digital literacy, what it means. It means also that you guys are talking at the same language. So it could be policy, it could be your salespeople, it could be all of that. So again, how do you understand it? What are you looking at? And what are the important things that you should be knowing about? So for example, are you talking about the importance and the significance of different texts to different people and different roles? They have just as much of responsibility to have an understanding of the impacts of what AI can bring and what it can do as you have to understand kind of what their roles are, what it looks like, what they're going to do. So a couple of things that I would kind of highlight here is there's a lot of areas where people have had successes, in integrated and diverse teams. These things are critical. Understanding what your team looks like, what the makeup is, what do you need, and how are you going to get it? So again, kind of going back to that fundamental first question is, how are you going to actually get people to use the things that you're building, that you're working on? And most of that goes with trust and understanding. So how do you start being able to articulate what it means and how it is? A couple of the other areas is you've seen the rise of things like human-centered design. With that is, again, we're designing things for humans. So understanding what those things are and how it is. Also looking at things like how do you describe what it is and what their role is, again. So their role is to be a critical thinker. Humans are inherently critical thinkers, and using things like AI to increase their computational power. So AI is, if you want to look at it as a thinker, would be more computationally inclined. And they can do those types of things. So when you're explaining to people, it is really talking about it, and we'll get to it in a little bit, is how do you start explaining what it's good at, what it's not, but in its most simplest terms. All right, so policy. This is one that no one ever loves when I originally include it, but this is the things that can help you and or hinder you. So make friends, you'll find, with a policy nerd, because they will be one of your best allies, especially in the areas of AI. And the reason for it is the policy is coming out faster and faster. Right now, the trends in policy are associated with, you should use this technology. You should use things like RPA. You should adapt and have AI. All of these things are there, quite honestly, to help you right now. And say, when you want to have a reason for why, not only because it's important, it's good, somebody told you to do it. Those are probably some of the easiest ways to start looking at it. You don't have to know all the specialty nuances. Fair warning, policy also has the downside too. It has the downside of what you can and can't do. So we're starting to see right now that the policy is in the route of putting a little more structure. And sometimes that's probably a good thing too, in terms of how and what it should be. Because just because you can doesn't mean you should. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, and this is changing rapidly. So right now, I don't know how many, but there's probably at least 10 to 15 different bills that are being proposed associated with how AI can be incorporated, used, the restrictions, all the governance aspects. We've gotten through the great wave. The great wave right now is use it, have it. Now we're going into what it means. So for you guys, especially in terms of adoption, that's also going to become a really important thing. Not that you have to be an expert, but understanding that you have a friend there who's going to help you understand and navigate what that looks like. All right, so who here has ever done a trust fall? All right, what was your initial reactions to doing it? Was it fear? Did you really trust the people that you were doing it with? Did you say you did one? Did you trust the people? Yeah. Okay, but you did trust them to start with. Who here wants to do trust falls with a room full of strangers? Anyone? Any takers? We can do it right now, You've done it with them? See, you're even Exactly. Well, you might be the only one who wants to go do it with a room full of strangers. Most of the reason and why they call it a trust fall is because you are going to trust somebody. All right, now the rise of explainable AI. All right, the reason is, think of it, that black box where you can say, well, I don't really know exactly and can't really explain to you exactly how it got to that decision and why it got to that decision, but is the equivalent of asking somebody who has to base their decisions, and whether it could be about life or business or work, you've literally just asked them to trust you, the equivalent of like doing a trust fall for AI. So the rise of this has really gotten into, because of the human element again, the transparency, the trust. I need to be able to figure out and audit it and tell people why it is I made these decisions and have some understanding in it. Again, so that gets into when we're developing things, when we're doing it, it is not just trust me, I know it's really good tech and it works. There's gonna have to be some middle ground of understanding how it works, why it works, and then so I can start building that trust for it. All right, the Sherpa inside of us all. So again, I won't ask this question, but it's kind of, I can pretty much tell you the answer is, how many people really want to go hike something like Mount Kilimanjaro without a Sherpa? Without that guide. See, it changes. Because without that guide, that's the person who knows the terrain. They've been there before. They know what to look out for, especially at the scary times. They're the person who's going to encourage you to keep on going. So how do we start doing it? Not that everybody has to be a full Sherpa, but again, how do you have some of those things that you remember and start talking about of saying, hey, what could I be doing? What are the aspects? You know what? I told you there's going to be some productivity loss. Okay, with that productivity loss, what does that look like? What could we do? How do we, but you know it's coming. So how do we plan for it and you talk to them about it? All right, so one area I want to talk about now is a lot of things associated with AI have been in the lab. So it's this successful, this prototype, this type of thing that we're working on, and they're all fantastic and show a great deal of promise. One of the areas that's coming up even bigger and bigger, and again, I showed you that statistic early on, is that 85% of the prototypes are failing. And where they're failing at, again, it's the human element, but why? It's you're trying to take it out of the lab and get it into the enterprise. So when you're trying to take it from one to the other, yes, there's the trust, there's those other things, but you also have to look at all the different aspects again. Is the infrastructure ready to do it? Is the data ready? Is the technology ready? Are the people ready? All of those things. While it's being planned and while you're working on technology, let's say this is something that fundamentally changes the way, the methods, the skills that they would use. Has that all been happening? Have they been getting training on how this is and how their day job is going to change? If they haven't been, chances are you're going to have some issues there. It's not going to look exactly like what you were planning. So this is probably one of the most critical areas, is to think about how, from all of those elements that we talked about earlier, do you operationalize AI and bring it into having it affect the mission or the business or whichever outcome that you're trying to get to with AI. So some of the things and the differences, so we get asked, what's the differences between being in the lab and the real world? So things like controlled data inputs, right? Or complex, variable, and novel data inputs. Inventor in the loop, or when you're in the lab and you're showing it to other R&D people or tech people, they're all pretty encouraging for the most part because they can see past and they can kind of see that vision of, that's really awesome. Look how hard that is. That is amazing. When you take it out of the lab and you start showing some of the user bases, they want to know that they can trust it and understand it, so they're going to be inherently skeptical to start with. When you're in the lab, you have really clearly defined problems. When you get into the real world, so whether it's the government or whether it's commercial, they all have their kind of unique set of issues, and people want to know that, hey, well, that's one tool there, but is that going to work for my unique human personal problems? Do I have to adapt to it? Is it going to adapt to me? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. So how do we really look at those? How do we understand what these things are? Again, being able to kind of explain some of the nuances and show the differences of saying, okay, yes, full acknowledgement. When it's in the lab, it's like this. When it goes to operations, there's going to be some things that it's going to be trial and error, or it's going to be, hey, we're going to have, again, that productivity loss, or we're going to have these things that we have to be working through. So having the understanding of what that journey looks like, what are all the aspects, becomes really critical. Okay, so where in the journey again? So I keep coming back to that because that's an important factor for people to understand, that this is also not a one and done. So a lot of the times when they do this, or let's say I'm going to go take a training class, I've taken it, I am now trained. AI is not that way, and especially there's so many different nuances, and it's rapidly evolving. So you guys all know this. As quick as the different technologies are coming out and things like that again. So they're going to keep going. Hey, well, no, you came back to me for that last thing, and now, no, but I said yes to that, but now you're asking me to change again. So may as well tell them up front. It's an evolution. This is how the things are working, how you would do, and hopefully you can get them at least on the mountain as opposed to not being there at all. And understanding that different parts of your organizations are going to be at different places. So even your best, your brightest, all the different ones are going to have these crazy nuances. So one of my favorite stories to tell is my parents are not your average senior citizens. Mine are ones who they've had computers in my house since I was little. I've always had them. My dad set up my first IM account. The house is fully networked. Right now, my brother's room is my parents' 3D printing room. My parents are in their 70s. 3D printing room where they have multiple 3D printers. My mother taught herself AutoCAD so she could design her cookie cutters. And then my dad prints them. So This is what my retired parents do in their spare time, in addition to going to seeing lighthouses all over the country. They have these things. But, so again, my dad, all of these times, he's embracing technology. He's there, you know, he's got everything. They're on streaming TV, they're doing everything. But he keeps posting these things on Facebook about how the automated tellers at Target are taking the jobs away from people. And I'm like, I don't understand, Daddy. What are you talking about? You complain all the time about there not being a person to help you and answer your questions. And so the sheer idea of it is, well, you don't like talking to the teller anyway. You always get annoyed by that. So why don't you do that? And then they can take that teller and they can be there to answer your questions and do higher level things. So again, it goes back to that earlier statement. It's about emotions and it's not always rational to start with. And some of your people who you think are gonna be the ones who absolutely are there and like the head up there leading the charge, the way, it depends. It depends on what kind of fear and what type of things or what aspects of it. And in my dad's case, the reason for it, because you know I couldn't help myself because I'm so interested in this, I dug into it a little bit more, is he has some family members and relatives who have worked at or in retail and they're really worried. And so it sparked his emotion that he's worried for them that they won't have a job. You know, they're a couple years from retirement and now this is all of those things, and they just have to get through those last couple of years. All right, so another way to look at it as, you know, who wants to go into any room full of non-tech people and explain what AI is? Any takers? Yeah. And when they say, oh wait, there's this definition versus that definition, or all of those things. So I would offer, think of it and try to talk to it as what are the outcomes? What can you do with it? You know, what are some key questions that could be answered? So things like, you know, what's happening now? You know, what do I need to know? And then you start talking about it like that. So for the what's happening now, that could be, you know, perception. I want to describe and understand my surroundings. Notification. I want to provide alerts, reminders. Suggestions, the recommenders, obviously use analogies. Things like when you go onto Amazon and you've purchased all of these things. Use those types of analogies. It helps. It helps greatly and say, you know, when you bought one thing and then it says all these other things that are there, yeah, I buy a lot, so they're getting pretty good right now. Automation. So think of it in the simplest aspect of routine steps that they would have to accomplish objectives. Prevention, prediction, you kind of get the idea. Really think of it as what it is and what it isn't. So we talked about it earlier. The current role of AI is a curator. It's a recommender. It's an orchestrator. Currently not the role is a critical thinker and decision maker. That is some parts of our roles and things that we're doing. Is it going to get there? Potentially. Is the answer of that? Yes. Do we have an idea of what time frame it is? Probably not. It's going to be different depending on what aspect you're talking about. You know, a decision maker for a very small, nuanced problem that doesn't have, you know, life's dependent on it, all those things, yeah, it's probably quicker than not, you know, versus some of the other areas. This is where our human ability comes into. And that's where you can actually talk to people about it and tapping into, hey, you have that critical thinking. That critical thinking is necessary and important. So having an understanding of what their role is in it. All right, so here's where I want to start kind of closing it out is some of the solutions for successful adoption. A lot of the areas I kind of bucket into 4 categories. So cultural willingness, data and infrastructure readiness, workforce skilling, and ethics, risk, and compliance. So these buckets are not all inclusive. I'm sure we can come up with a whole bunch of other ones, but these are ones to kind of get you started in terms of all of the things that we've been talking about throughout this. So from cultural willingness, you know, why is the technical project that you're doing, how is that going to affect the mission of the organization? Is it going to, if it's a business, is it going to help us make money? Is it going to help us give a better product? Is it going to, if you're in, let's say, a government organization, fulfill the mission that we are supposed to be doing, whether it's saving lives or those types of things? Connect it to what it is and why you're here, what you're doing. Then things like in data and infrastructure readiness. So again, there's some human sides and non-human sides is, what are the strategy? What are the guidance? How do you get people? Again, work with some of your strategy friends, work with all of those. How many times have you gotten a whole bunch of data that is awful and it is in the worst shape ever? So understanding that you can't just take it. So I can't tell you how many times I've worked with clients and they said, I have all of this data. You guys are going to be able to do some great things with it right away. Why can't you? So having an understanding that there's more nuance to it. And not leading with, I implore you to not lead with, oh, you just don't get it or understand. Or write them off, because they have a lot of functional and expertise too that could actually improve upon of what you need to do. So again, I would go to that outcome. What is the outcome that you're trying to get to? What do you need? How do you do that? The workforce skilling. So this one's a big one, and it's a big topic that keeps coming out all over everywhere. There's been some hit and misses. There's been some good and bad. I'll give you a couple examples. One of the ones that happened the most is where organizations say, we're just going to train everybody in, let's say, data science. It'll be great. We'll have a whole cadre of data scientists. This has been tried a whole bunch of times, by the way, not just in data science, but before. I had one client that they had a whole bunch of people who were cartographers, and they decided they were going to teach cold fusion and thought all the cartographers could become developers and that aspects. It didn't go over so well. That was a while ago. So now the same things are happening with like data science and stuff. There first has to be a thing that you actually want to do it. You want to have some interest in it and some fundamental skills. So there's a lot of different levels. Not everyone needs to be a data scientist to have an impact and get you the help of what you need. So there's things of digital literacy. So things like Andrew Nye's AI for Everyone, that is a great one. I point people to that all the time, to have just kind of a digital literacy and understanding of what in the world are these things. So again, it's not incumbent that you have to teach everybody everything of how to talk to you and what it is, but you can offer them some resources and things. There's plenty of free ones out there. There's also executive level. But I would say that when it really matters, one thing to think about is actually give some definitions of what you mean. So for example, if you're talking about machine learning, if you're talking about AI or RPA, actually politely define it in a sense, because even with people who are within the tech field have different definitions of what those mean. So define it of what it means for you so that they can at least be in the same kind of playing field of understanding of what you mean by it and what you're trying to do with it. Ethics. This is an area that is critically important, and it's one that keeps coming up for humans. We're human. We want things to be ethical. We want to know that we can trust it. We want to know that our great work is not going to be used for bad. We want to have those types of things. So the understanding of how you account for those things technically, explain it to me. What is adversarial AI? How do I know if I'm going to be attacked or different things like that? How is ethical aspects being built in for transparency and bias? How do I understand it? Give me some indication of how it is you're building that in, or at least thinking about it and putting those types of things in there. And so finally, really think of it as that journey again. So I want to kind of close with that. Think of it as a journey. What is it that you're trying to get to? Where are you trying to go? And know that that journey is going to be a while, but it can have a lot of great rewards in the meantime. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, thoughts, any kind of feedback.
What is the most successful transformation that you've seen where a company has adopted AI on a smaller scale?
So I've seen it in a couple different ways. Most of it is right now in the much smaller scale. So it's not the full out enterprise. It's the ones who have access probably, so it's a little bit less in the government. The government's trying to play the catch up, to be fair, and the reason is because what technology is allowed. And there's this cultural phenomenon that's been happening that people who have, like their phone, right? They're using AI all the time. They're doing these things. They have Alexa there. But as soon as they walk in the door, they don't have access to those, and they've somehow deemed that okay. And so those are probably the opposite of what you're saying, is like they've seen that. The ones that are probably like a lot of the transportation industry, again, some of the commercial retail, a lot of those are the much more successful because, quite honestly, some of those things are just happening in the background, and it's not, this is AI. It's just happening. So I think that's the first part of it, of where you're seeing is the parts where they're not actually telling people. And so there's parts of organizations that, whether it's their back office, all of those things that are happening, and then people are using those to point as examples of, hey, this is already happening within our company. And then they're starting to kind of build the trust from there. The other aspects are the ones who are taking a little bit different look at the human-centered design aspects of where we may not go to this stage, but we may go to this stage, and then decrease the amount of time between each of the stages.
So when you talk about human-centered design, and everybody in this room has their own bent or bias in themselves. And the biggest problem with dealing with AI in human-centered points of view is to create the model. Because some human must select that data. How do you then mitigate or try to educate the data scientist, the recipient who's going to receive the system? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so it's not a perfect solution, but where we kind of start with is, again, that demystifying and defining of what it is we mean by this. So getting to the literal sense, not being patronizing, not any of those things, but literally saying, this is the definition of what we see this as. This is how it would work. Is this what you want to do? Then on the flip side, so let's say it's a user, right? Them talking about it in the purest sense of what it is they want the outcome from using that, and start matching them up in that sense. A lot of the times it's where we're taking much more agile approaches to data science and working in those types of approaches is helping. It's helping because you're getting that iterative feedback. And at least for us, what we're finding is that a lot of the times of what the starting place was looks very different than what the outcome was, because of taking agile approach and really truly defining what it is.
Two questions. How is the government's maturity in terms of issuing policy? Second question, how does your government client has achieved the kind of objective? What's the rate? Do they also fall into the 85% failure?
So I work for Booz Allen. I can't speak on behalf of the government, but I can tell you a couple things. So I can tell you that in general, across different clients and things that we're looking at, is the government is the ones who are issuing a lot of the policy. So they have the understanding, and there's a reason that the first part of the policy was trying to start mandating use. It is so that they can start getting it in. So in your sense, if you would extrapolate, that they are part of that 85% where projects have not been going successful.
So I'd kind of push back a little bit on that 85%, because from my perspective, not all of your pilot projects should work.
Agreed.
Because that's why they're pilots. So if 85% of them don't work out, maybe it means you're just being very creative, and that's why they're not going.
Oh, I don't disagree with you at all. I actually thank you for pushing back on that. So I would kind of spin it slightly different. Is not all things are going to make it into production. They never should. And that part of that is a frank kind of conversation where not everyone understands that and understands the nuances of the R&D life cycle of how many things that you would have there. So I would say that's probably a critical thing to explain to people, that that's a pretty average thing. But when you're looking at investors and amounts of money, is they're seeing, oh, we have spent how much amount of money and we haven't gotten anything through. But the point I was probably, and didn't articulate as clearly, was that it's on the rise, it's not on the decline. And so the rise of projects failing, and that rise is an important thing to understand, that it's still going and there's got to be some reasons for it. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, then thank you so much.
Do you see any kind of collaboration towards industry KPIs as AI becomes more prevalent?
I'm sorry?
Do you see any kind of collaboration in industries towards KPIs as API becomes more prevalent?
I would, yeah. I haven't seen it like wholesale yet, but I would definitely think so. Key performance indicators and things of what it is. I would see that that's going to be coming out across the board as standards.